And so a new chapter begins.
You are Locked On Fantasy Basketball, your daily fantasy basketball podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast brought to you by Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd and I am the lead fantasy analyst at basketballmonster.com, and you can find me as always on Twitter at redrock_bball. Today we are looking at the Miami Heat as their season preview is ready to go. Michael Bolton.
Let's get to it.
Let's get to it indeed. To help me preview the Miami Heat, I'm joined by one of the hosts of the Locked On Heat podcast. David Ramil is here. David, welcome back to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
All right, so let's talk about this Miami Heat team, which of course has had some changes like so many other teams throughout this off-season. Lots of interesting maneuvers and departures and additions. Let's start with the big one. Jimmy Butler is here, bringing himself across from the Philadelphia 76ers. It did cost Josh Richardson to get Butler, but Butler slides in to back to that role he had where he was the unquestioned number one player with both the Bulls and the Minnesota Timberwolves. I think we're going to see quite a bit from Butler here in terms of usage increasing from where he was in Philadelphia, assist rate increasing. He is pretty much just going to be the offensive leader on this team, isn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was the role they were hoping Josh would accept last season. Didn't quite work out that way. His defense struggled a little bit, and he wasn't quite ready to accept the offensive burden. But I think Butler obviously is a much more complete player and somebody they were looking to acquire for a couple of years now. So he's finally come to Miami, and I think they're going to be making the most of his talents.
I saw his assist numbers drop to 4 per game and under 19 points. I think he goes back to that 22, 5, and 5 sort of numbers he had during that time in Minnesota. Maybe he even goes higher than that, making him a solid second-round player for this coming season. ESPN's got him ranked too low at 29. He's a top 20 guy to me. Yahoo at 15, that's about the right spot, 15 to 18, that sort of area for Jimmy Butler. Do you think we're going to see 37 minutes a night Jimmy Butler like we saw in Chicago and Minnesota?
I don't think so. Spoelstra is kind of hesitant to go with anybody for that prolonged period of time, so I wouldn't assume that they'd go that high. Probably just below 35 minutes seems about right.
Yeah, that's where I've got him. I've got him at 34 minutes a game for this coming season, which puts him in that middle second round area. And yeah, back to those numbers that we saw from him in Minnesota in terms of that playmaking, especially really jumping back up. And if that exceeded 5 a game in terms of his assist numbers, I wouldn't be surprised at all to see those numbers really jump back up and be that guy who was handling the ball so much with the Bulls and with the Timberwolves. The other big interesting situation here in Miami is, of course, the change in the starting center. Well, not a change exactly, because at the end of last season, Bam Adebayo was the starting center, but now he doesn't have Hassan Whiteside breathing down his neck. So I'm really excited to see what Bam's going to do this season. During the end of last season, he was playing 26, 27 minutes a night. I think that goes up considerably this season. Where do you see Adebayo for this coming year? He's third in the NBA.
Yeah, I think he'll probably be somewhere around 30 minutes per game. They don't have much behind him, although I could see some rotations with Kelly Olynyk kind of backing him up at center, and obviously Myers Leonard, who came over in the Hassan Whiteside deal. Those are the only legitimate options to play the center position aside from Bam. It's just there's still questions about how much responsibility Bam can handle, because he has not shown any kind of aggressiveness, and I'm not sure that he has a polished enough offensive game where he can be the kind of superstar player a lot of us expect him to be able to achieve at some point. He has the talent, he has the athleticism, the tools are all there. He just hasn't been able to put them together just yet, and I wonder if this is the season where we'll finally start to see it.
And then when looking for like a comparison for Adebayo fantasy-wise, he's very much like an Al Horford guy. He'll get rebounds, he'll score, he gets assists, he gets steals, he gets blocks, he's efficient from the field, he's efficient from the line. He doesn't hit threes at this point. Maybe that will start to come. I think he's a top 50 guy for this coming season. He is ranked far too low on ESPN at 134. He's at 42 on Yahoo, which is relatively aggressive. 64 on Fantrax. There's still some value to be had there. But to me, he's that fourth or fifth round sort of a player who should take a pretty significant leap forward from his overall numbers from last season. But even back end of last year, in the final 28 games over the last 2 months of the season, 26 minutes a night, he was the 69th ranked player during that time frame, and he should be able to fairly easily exceed the 26 minutes a night he played down the stretch there with that elite efficiency, rebounding, steal, and block numbers from Adebayo. I'm pretty excited to see what he's going to do. I think he's one of the big sleepers in certain formats of fantasy for this coming season up ahead. Now, what is interesting here is how this starting lineup is going to look. We've got Butler locked in. We've got Adebayo locked in. I think we should probably be locking Kelly Olynyk in there as the power forward. But those other positions, where's Justise Winslow fitting on this team?
That's a big question, and I think that's one that's still unanswered, to be honest with you. I think a lot of people expect him to be the starting point guard or de facto point guard because it's more than likely that Jimmy will be handling the ball considerably as he brings the ball up court, initiates offense. And, just like you mentioned, the way he was in Minnesota, even to some extent in Philadelphia as well, even with Ben Simmons there, he'll probably still be initiating offense for a great deal of Miami's offensive possessions. Justise can handle the point. They also have Goran Dragic there, but I see Goran now at his age probably being better as a off the bench scorer and of course playmaker as well. So I would still say Justise is the starting point guard at this point. You could have him playing the three defensively. That's still an option, and then Jimmy can kind of slide over to the two. It's all about who complements him in the backcourt. To me, I think the other starting guard is probably going to be Dion Waiters, although you could make a case that Justise and Goran could play in the backcourt too. But I think Goran's shooting and his stability, his presence, I think is probably a little bit better suited as the off-the-bench leader. He'll probably be a really great sixth man for this team. Tyler Hero, their first-round pick, probably isn't going to get those kind of minutes a lot of people expect him to. So
David, you there? All right, we've got David back now. We were just talking a little bit about Tyler Hero and his minutes, but as for Winslow, he's a guy that has never had a top 100 fantasy season before. In fact, his last season was his best year, 131st overall in under 30 minutes a game. Do you think he's back in that 30-minute a night role, whether that is as a starting point guard, as a starting small forward, or coming off the bench?
Yeah, that seems about right. He's primed for it, obviously, and he's capable of handling it. He's not going to be initiating as much offense with Jimmy there, but he seems to be a guy who's capable of playing, obviously a lot of minutes. He's versatile enough as a defender, and I think his scoring has continued to come around. And, I think that as long as that shot is falling consistently, he should get a bulk of the minutes.
I think he's interesting as a late round guy, 11th, 12th round sort of a player, but he has deficiencies in his field goal percentage, in his free throw percentage. I think because of the Butler arrival, we'll see that assist rate drop. Now, his assist rate went from 3.2 assists per 36 up to 5.2 last season. I can see that coming back down to a number somewhere in between those two for this coming season with Butler around to take a lot more of that ball handling. We have to remember that role that he had last season was without Butler and, of course, without Dragic for a big chunk of that season as well. So I don't think he's going to be able to stick at that level. He's never been a high level shot blocker either, and he shoots threes at an okay percentage, not a massive volume there. So I think he's okay as a back end guy. I just don't see really that huge level of upside for Winslow coming up. Now, you mentioned something interesting with Goran Dragic. I never really even anticipated that he could be coming off the bench in a sixth man role. How do you think he would handle that if that was the role that he was given?
I think he's comfortable with it. He did handle it in some spots last year as he was coming back from injury, obviously. But at the same time, I think he's come to grips with his age. And, there were some trade talks during the offseason as well. And that probably put a damper on his hopes of being a long-term piece here. He's on the last year of his contract. But he's still so solid overall as a player that I think he can adapt to any role. And even at his age, I think he'd be a little bit more comfortable just coming off the bench.
At the end of last season, he did start the final 8 games of the season, played big minutes in a lot of them, 38, 37, 39, 37, 38, 39, 32, and then just 9 minutes in the season finale. He had a 30-point game there, a triple-double, 23, 12, and 11 as well, which is a little bit of a surprise if you think back to the season that Dragic had last season. For him to even put those numbers up is something that I don't think many people would really remember. I'm not sure that he's going to come off the bench. I think that he's still going to get... Well, let's put it this way. Do you think he's still going to be a 30-minute-a-night player regardless of whether he's starting or not?
No, I don't. I think his minutes are going to continue to dwindle. I mean, I don't think injury issues are going to be there, but at his age, and given the fact that you've got so many other primary ball handlers and Dion, Justice, Jimmy, obviously, you just don't need Goran as much. So I wouldn't see him being a 30 minutes per game guy.
Interesting. I still had him around that 30-minute mark, so we'll see how that all pans out. I still think that upside for him is pretty limited. His legendary efficiency is not at the same level anywhere near where it was when he was a 50% field goal guy a couple of years ago. He's just not that player anymore, so I don't think we need to be looking at him as an elite fantasy asset. But last year was the first time he'd finished outside the top 100 in 7 or 8 seasons. I expect him to finish outside the top 100 again this year. He's ranked 135th on Yahoo, 112th on ESPN. That's okay in that level, but again, if what David said is true, then coming off that bench in that more limited role, it's probably going to push him out of standard league discussions. The other spot in that starting lineup is the shooting guard position. Dion Waiters. We know that he's had those ankle problems over the last couple of seasons. He appears to be healthy at the moment. Do you think that how much should we be buying into that, I guess, when we're looking at Dion Waiters and the off-season workout videos?
I'm actually buying into it quite a bit. I actually had a chance to talk to his trainer, David Alexander of DBC Fitness, who's worked with LeBron James, Victor Oladipo, Chris Paul, and others. And you've seen videos this offseason of Paul looking phenomenal shape and kind of getting back into the kind of playing shape he was for a few years with the Los Angeles Clippers. And so I look at Dion, and from what Alexander told me, he's lost a considerable amount of weight. He's down to about 203 pounds. He might even drop below that. And this is like the lowest playing weight he's been at for quite some time. We saw a photo today, I think, from his Instagram post, kind of showing him being honestly quite svelte, and he's lost a considerable amount of weight, and he's got something to prove here. That's another part too, is with Dion, all the injuries issues, all the contract talk, everything else that's come over the last few years in Miami, he wants to put that behind him. And from what his trainer told me, he's more confident than ever before. So now that his body is fully healthy, he's really looking to make an impact. How much Jimmy allows him to make that impact kind of remains to be seen, but we saw a lot of shooting from Dion Waiters, so I would expect him to kind of be more of a catch and shoot guy, mixing in some of that ability to drive to the rim, which he can still do. He still has that quick first step. Even with the weight issues last year, he was still a very capable guard getting to the rim, not necessarily finishing at a high level or an efficient level, but I would expect that to increase. I would see his shooting numbers kind of hovering around what they were last year, to be honest with you.
Yeah, look, he can shoot the 3-ball well. The problem is he's a bad free throw shooter. His overall field goal percentage isn't high. He does provide assists, but from a fantasy point of view, he is generally pretty underwhelming. Low defensive numbers, really, really poor rebounder as well. So I think he's more a guy we look at for deeper leagues, 14-team leagues, that sort of a situation. Maybe he can crack the top 150, but that's not a guarantee, even if he is a 30-minute-a-night guy as a starter, which I imagine he gets pretty close to being on this Heat team. You mentioned it earlier. A lot of people seem to think that Tyler Hero is coming in and playing this huge role. I don't think that. I'm glad you agree with me there on that. What are we expecting from Hero? I think he will be a rotation guy immediately.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think his shooting's just too good to kind of keep warming up on the bench there. So I would expect him to get some minutes. But there are questions about his defensive versatility. He can't switch on to bigger forwards. He's not quick enough to handle smaller ball handlers either. He's short-limbed, which is why there were questions about him in the draft period. Maybe his athleticism isn't elite level yet. He's also got great work ethic, though. So the expectations and the hope, I think, is that Miami can kind of embrace him and have him embrace their culture, that he'll get in the best shape of his life and somehow be a functional player. But I don't see that happening for at least a couple of seasons.
What did you make of his summer league?
It's summer league. It was great to see him comfortable with shooting the ball. One of the things that really stood out, and he actually spoke to my co-host Wes Goldberg about, is that his shooting, as many people expect him to be kind of a catch and shoot player, he's not that kind of a shooter. He's more of a shooting off the dribble. And so he has to kind of incorporate the catch and shoot motion into his repertoire because he's not quite comfortable with it yet. But I expect with, again, Goran probably coming off the bench, Jimmy and others, handling the ball, that Tyler Hero is not going to get the same kind of opportunity to initiate offense that he did in college or obviously in high school. He's still so young, so he's got plenty of time, plenty of upside still. I just don't see him tying it all together this year as much as I'd like to see it.
I think that he is going to be the best free throw shooter in the NBA this season. That's my wild take. I think he's going to have the highest free throw percentage of all rotation players in the NBA this season. He missed, 10 free throws through all of his college. Again, in Summer League was at 95%. I think he's going to be a 93, 94% guy this year.
That's fair, but I wouldn't see many takes. I mean, because he's a rookie, just because he doesn't necessarily initiate a lot of contact either, I would still say as he's kind of getting a feel for the game. He's not going to be driving to the rim. He's going to have his welcome to the NBA moment, and that's probably going to shake some of that confidence free there. And so I don't know how many shots at he's going to get at the free throw line, but he will knock them down at a pretty high clip. I think that you're absolutely right there.
Do you think Kelly Olynyk is pretty fairly entrenched as the starting power forward?
Yeah, there aren't many other options. It's either him or James Johnson, and I think the threat of Kelly Olynyk as a shooter is still valuable than whatever ball handling and versatility James Johnson provides defensively. Like, Olynyk is not a bad defender necessarily, although he doesn't offer much rim protection at 7 feet. So he's going to be guarding quicker fours. They're going to get past him. Then Bam Adebayo is going to be expected to clean up a lot of those messes. At the same time, offensively, you can run a lot of pick and pop between him and Jimmy Butler. He is a creative ball handler and passer, so there's opportunities for him to make plays for himself and others. I still see him as the starting four and Johnson coming off the bench, because I think James is still a little bit more capable in a role, in a bench role. I think that's where he's thrived for most of his career, and even with the Heat, although he had a number of starts last year, I think that was just because of the injuries to Olynyk and others that he kind of had to take over that role. I would still see James Johnson coming off the bench with Olynyk starting.
Olynyk in the final 28 games of last season played 28 minutes a night. He was a top 100 fantasy guy there, really high free throw percentage, good field goal percentage. He scored okay, hit some threes, steals were not too bad, didn't block that many shots, but he was okay. But again, just limited overall upside. With Olynyk, Johnson is going to cut into that time. Olynyk's not going to be playing 32, 33 minutes or anything along those lines. So he's going to be solid enough, provide decent and interesting enough back-end value. You still can get him at some value on Fantrax and on ESPN, but upside overall is pretty limited. I saw it, James Johnson had some quotes that he's seen pretty pissed off that people were writing him off, and he expects a big bounce back. Well, I don't really see it from him. He is 32 years of age already. He showed some significant decline last season, and the injuries did catch up with him, just 55 games and 21 minutes a night. Is that the sort of role we're expecting from Johnson again, that 21, 22 minute a night role?
Probably, although I would expect his efficiency to increase a little bit. He did have that lingering groin issue from when he had surgery the previous offseason. I remember him at Media Day talking about wanting to get out there right away. And of course, we didn't see him for a few months still. So it took him a lot longer. And then once he did get back, his conditioning was already a few steps behind. He looked a little heavy, a little bloated, just never seemed to be quite as athletic or explosive as he had been earlier with his stint in Miami. But he's really embraced the Heat culture, and obviously he's been in great shape during his tenure there for the most part. I think he's back there. I think he's going to be a little bit more effective. And I don't know if he'll necessarily grumble about a bench role either. I think he can be very effective coming off the bench. And as long as he accepts that, and I expect that he will, he'll probably be a pretty good asset, to be honest with you.
Johnson's a guy that's had a multiple top 100 seasons during his time in Miami. I don't think he gets back to that, but he was a guy that averaged a steal, a block, and a 3 per game back in the 16-17 season. Also got assists, but I think we're a fair way removed from that same sort of player Johnson is. Of course, if the minutes do bump up, he's still going to have some of that ability to play make, to create defensive numbers, which is something you should pay some attention to. But really, just looking at him as a deeper league guy is probably going to be your best bet at this point. Now, a guy that I get probably a disproportionate amount of questions about, he lies on this Heat roster, and his name is Derrick Jones Jr. People get really excited about this guy. Maybe it's the dunks, maybe it's the crazy just bundles of defensive stats that he puts up. What are we looking at in terms of Jones? Now, at last season, beginning of the year, he didn't find a really defined role until injuries hit, but to me, he now seems like he is going to be in there as that 8th or 9th man on this roster.
That's probably where he'll wind up. I still don't know after a couple of years of watching Derrick play up close. I just don't know what to expect out of him. There's potential there. Obviously, there's plenty of athleticism, and he's got great length at his position. I think part of the reason why he was as efficient as he was because Spoelstra was incorporating him into those defensive matchups there, and he was able to really exploit that. But at the same time, like offensively, he is still so limited. He does not handle the ball very well. He doesn't create plays for others, and his shooting is still so suspect that I can't count on him to be a reliable player. Like, the tools are there, just as they were when he was, selected by Phoenix a couple of years ago. But part of the reason why they made him so expendable was because he had never tied it together, and he still has not done so in Miami. And I'm not sure if this is a season for him to do so. And there's not many opportunities left for a guy like him. He could be a great player on occasion, but for him to tie it all together just hasn't been something that we've seen from him in Miami.
Yeah, that's the thing. He is inconsistent. The shooting is a real problem. He can put up defensive numbers, but I just don't see a large enough role for him to really have too much of an impact. So many people get really excited about Derrick Jones, and they regard this is the year he steps forward. And he still is just 22 years of age, but I don't see him tying it all together. I don't see the ball handling or the scoring or the shooting or all that sort of stuff coming together. But the defensive upside is obviously pretty interesting, but outside of that, not much else. Myers Leonard probably rounds out the rotation, I would say, as the 10th man, the backup center on this squad, who had some definite moments in the playoffs last year for the Portland Trailblazers against the Warriors. He's had moments in the playoffs before. He can shoot. He obviously has his defensive limitations, but there's no real risk of him coming in and starting to take 24, 25 minutes away from Olynyk or Adebayo, is there?
No, I don't really see it. I mean, he's already engaged in off-season workouts. He's been with the team ever since the trade took place, and he seems happy and engaged here. And, he's on a contract here, so that's always going to play a factor. Other than that, I don't know that he's going to have a huge leap this season. I just don't see that there's going to be any ability for him to tie it all defensively. He's not going to get any more fleet-footed. He's not going to be able to switch on to smaller ball handlers, and he doesn't offer much rim protection at his size either. So he's kind of like a more awkward Kelly Olynyk who could probably shoot a little better and not necessarily good enough to actually take away any of Kelly's minutes either. So he's not an impact player, at least not the way I see it just yet.
The last two games in the playoffs last year against the Warriors, he had 16 and 3 with 3 triples in 31 minutes, and in the final game, 30 and 12 with 5 threes in 40 minutes. I don't think many people would remember that he played 40 minutes in a closeout playoff game for the Blazers against the Warriors in those conference finals. But yeah, he's more of that deeper league guy who can come in and hit some threes and be a decent enough rebounder with good efficiency, but the minutes just aren't there. Those 10 guys are fairly locked in as the rotation pieces, and the rest of the roster is a little bit weird. Kendrick Nunn, who played some point guard in Summer League, he looks to be the third string point guard at this point.
Yeah, he had a great Summer League, actually. I think he even outperformed Tyler Hero, and we saw some nice ability from Nunn there. He's still a little bit slow as a ball handler. He doesn't have a tight dribble either. He can get to the rim. He's kind of stocky. He's unfortunately a poor man's Dion Waiters, so that's saying quite a bit about his ability to kind of make an impact in the NBA. I don't see him getting much playing opportunity at all, to be honest with you. I'm not sure if he's eligible to spend any time with the Sioux Falls Skyforce or the G League, but I would expect him to kind of hone his craft for a little bit there and then kind of get some minutes with the Heat, because otherwise I just don't see much playing ability there.
Duncan Robinson's a guy that is interesting to me. I thought his Summer League was pretty solid as well. He can shoot, we know that, and this team would be very interested in getting some shooting in there. Is there any way he can force himself into a role maybe ahead of a Derrick Jones if that shooting from Jones still doesn't come around?
Yeah, that's the key, I think, with that shooting. He is a legitimate shooter, and he's big enough to play the 4 too, although I think he could play anywhere from the 2 through 4 spot. He's probably better suited at the power forward. He's got some nice athleticism there. He's not versatile enough defensively just yet, but he can get there. He's still young, and that shooting is pretty solid. So if he does if he makes the most of those opportunities and he's able to knock down 3-point shots with some regularity, I could see him getting some minutes over Derrick Jones Jr.
Last player I want to touch on here, David, is the rookie KZ Okpala. I didn't love the pick. It's not a terrible pick at that spot. I don't really see him having any sort of impact this season, but is he just going to be one of those guys that the Heat throw out to their G League team to try and develop this season?
Yeah, that's absolutely it. He's going to be great in Sioux Falls, and he has all the tools, the versatility there. I think obviously that offense is still a little inconsistent, but they love his length. They love his defensive presence, and there are high hopes there that in a year or two he'll probably be able to tie it all together and be a rotation player. This season isn't in it, though.
Yeah, he's not going to have too much of an impact this year. What do you think his main standout skill is?
I think it's defensive versatility. The hope is that he's long-limbed, he's quick-foot, and he has some awareness on the defensive side there. Offensively, he can handle the ball, but I'd say his defense is probably his calling card right now.
All right, so a lot of the times guys like that don't translate very well for fantasy, so we'll see whether he can actually generate defensive stats, and watching him in the G League will be key for Dynasty League people who want to pay attention to Okpala and see what sort of numbers he can put up over there. This Heat, the roster's it's relatively thin. There's still a few positions to be filled. We haven't talked about Udonis Haslem because he's not really there to play. He's there just because he's Udonis Haslem, and until he decides he doesn't want to play anymore, he will continue to get that final spot on the roster. And then there's a whole bunch of non-guaranteed guys: Chris Silver, Jeremiah Martin, Kyle Alexander. What else are the Heat looking to do at the back end of this roster? Because there's still a few spots available.
Yeah, I don't know if they're just kind of keeping that flexibility for cap purposes. I think they're trying to kind of keep things a little bit more cheaply. They're obviously hard pressed against the cap right now, so they don't have many options either. I think they're also still looking at the potential trade to acquire either Chris Paul, maybe Bradley Beal. Obviously they've been linked to these names throughout the offseason, so I think that's why they're trying to keep it somewhat flexible. But I think the rotation, as you pointed out, is what it is, and that's how it's going to be set for the start of the season.
All right, so let's have a look at some value picks here. Bam Adebayo is the obvious one at 134 on ESPN. That's just silly to have him there. While a bust, it was hard to find. Yahoo's got Myers Leonard at 167, which is probably too high for me. But even then, that's not egregiously bad. It is still pretty bad. But overall, the guys are ranked relatively fairly outside of Adebayo being at 134 for this Heat team. David, thank you for jumping on and talking about the Heat for me on Locked On Fantasy Basketball.
Always a pleasure. Thank you so much, Josh.
That will wrap it up for me on today's podcast. I forgot to tell David to plug his Twitter handle. It is at DRamil13, DRAMIL13. So go follow him there and check out Locked On Heat. As well as this podcast, subscribe, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher. Give it 5 stars. It would be great. On YouTube, hit subscribe, leave a comment, give it a thumbs up. Share it with your friends as well. It's a great way for me to help grow this show and bring you more and better content throughout the season. Follow me on Twitter at redrock_bball, guys. We are done here. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya. Myers Leonard.